The Life and Letters of John Muir, Volume 1. Annotated and illustrated. Written by William Frederick Baudet.
So the idea of republishing his volumes 1 and volume 2 is to share with a modern audience, maybe provide a different perspective. And each of you have contributed to that in terms of writing the introduction. Stephen wrote it for volume 1, Mike Wurtz wrote it for volume 2, and then Harold wrote an epilogue for volume 2. So if I was to kind of just go through that contribution, and let's start with volume 1 with Stephen Hetch. Stephen, what, just maybe if you just give us a little summary of what you wrote in that introduction, with the idea that someone's going to go and buy the book or get the book and they're going to read the full introduction.
I basically summarized his life, the major events of his life, just briefly, from his birth in Scotland to various events here in the States. And then I talked about, since my take on Muir is his mystical spirituality, I talked a bit about that. And I talked about the sense that he really had this experience of losing his individuality into a larger whole, into nature. But then, interestingly, it's as though he received it back again, as he would say, washed and clean, as though by Yosemite Falls. So there's really that sense of oneness. And yet he still retains his individuality, in that he receives it back in a new way after he merges with nature. So I emphasize that.
Yeah, and you did a really nice job with that. I appreciate reading it, and it kind of helped me have a deeper appreciation for that particular volume. So Mike, your introduction to volume 2. And traditionally, this book is not, when it's been republished, it kind of comes out as one book, I've noticed. And we intentionally decided to put it into 2 volumes, which I think is giving more voice to being able to have an introduction. There is an introduction by Baudet for volume 1, but there is not one for volume 2. But
it's like a portable archive. And that's what I think is really special about both books, is that aspect of it. And also this idea that, that Muir never wrote an autobiography, and this is really an autobiography. So it's this idea of kind of bringing together, and it's written at a very interesting time too. It's the 1920s, where the American people are still kind of struggling with what we do with nature. What does that mean? And so we get a little bit of that in here too. And it's written by a friend of Muir too. So you're going to get a really straight up, pleasant history of John Muir. It's we're gonna focus on all the wonderful things that he did, and I think that's what really makes this that makes this pretty special. I think another thing that's really cool about this, and that's this idea that it is pretty much a straightforward biography. It's so much of, and we may get into this a little bit later, but so much of what's been written about Muir since then are, we try to understand Muir, I use that in quotes. We want to understand him. We want to figure him out. And in this book, it's just saying, here it is. Here's what happened to John Muir. That you interpret for yourself. And that, as an archivist, this is something I love. It's like, I'm going to give you all the tools. Now you get to decide how you want to interpret Muir's life.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because we all have our kind of interpretation of him, right? I mean, I made the Unruly Mystic John Muir,
right,
feature-length documentary on him, which touches on the inspiration of how people have responded to him in their lives. Stephen Hetch is in that. I encountered you, Mike Wurtz, at Yosemite when you were working on your book and doing research with it. I remember I made a video of you there. And then also talking with Harold and his depth of knowledge and his support of all things Muir. I remember when I had first put the movie out there, the trailer, this comment on YouTube from somebody telling me that we didn't have the right tree in terms of what he was climbing. And if you remember in the movie, each person talking about that stop climbing this tree. And then, Harold corrected, had the official answer of what the right tree was. So Harold, you wrote the epilogue, which I was sharing with you guys is much longer than both introductions combined, roughly. It comes out in terms of the audiobook at about 30 minutes. And I know when I read it, I felt like I was really getting this amazing perspective of all the steps that John Muir had taken, without having to go through and read like another book and another book, another book. So if you would go ahead and kind of share with us your work there, that would be great.
Sure. Well, the take I tried to take in the epilogue was not you two guys had done, laid the groundwork of what you're going to be reading. So I was more like, well, now what does this mean? And it was ironic. You republished this book, Michael, in 2023. So it's exactly 100 years before its first publication in 1923. Many of the books say 1924. But I have first edition says 1923 on it, so I use that as the founding date. So what's happened in the succeeding years? So what I try to do in the epilogue, and that's why it's pretty lengthy, is I thought, well, let's summarize the last 100 years of Muir's legacy and where has it gone? From his first ideas of national parks and associated with Yosemite, but he had a lot to do with other national parks like Petrified Forest and Grand Canyon by getting Roosevelt to designate those as national monuments first before they could be established as national parks. So I just took that opportunity to kind of go through that subsequent history, especially a focus on the meaning of national parks, the meaning of wilderness areas, which Muir is so associated with. And I think my main thesis of the epilogue was Muir was planting the seed. And it's a mistake to say, okay, Muir was it, that was the end. No, it was the seed. And since then, it's grown and flowered into different directions and evolved. So the national park idea has evolved to such an extent that it can include restoration of habitats. It can mean removing dams, such as in the Olympic National Park, 2 dams were removed. Proposal to remove Hetchy, the dam in Hetchy, in order to restore that valley is a proposal today. You also have the concept of not just restoration, but rewilding. So this is what's happening in the national parks in Chile, that they're going through areas that had been trammeled, as the Wilderness Act said, and had been farmed or ranched, is being rewilded back into nature. And Dave Foreman is the one who coined that term rewilding, but he was a devotee of Muir. So part of what I was trying to say is, since Muir's time, all the conservationists and national park advocates and wilderness defenders since then all kind of go back to that wellspring of Muir, but that doesn't mean they stay there. They evolve their ideas. So a national park in Africa, for example, might have indigenous people in it. It doesn't have to be the Western traditional idea. And for Muir, wilderness was really important. And he would talk about Hetchy should be absolute wild. And then he'd say, except for the hotels and roads necessary for people to get there and enjoy it. So, he was always considered a preservationist, but he also wanted people to get there and to enjoy it. So it's the complex balance, because to me, Yosemite is an atrocity today because of the overcrowding with the vehicles. And there are days in the summer that people drive in the park and they can't even find a parking place. They just drive through and have to drive out. Well, that's no way to experience a national park. So there needs to be some further evolution of the national park idea. For Yosemite Valley, I would see something like Zermatt, where you have a train that goes in and there's no vehicles allowed. That's the way they do it in Zermatt, Switzerland. It's time to be thinking about doing that in Yosemite too. So I'm just saying that there are ways of growing the national park idea. It might even be your own backyard. It could be part of this backyard national park that Doug Tallamy wants to create. So it's a continual evolution.
This has been The Life and Letters of John Muir, annotated and illustrated. Written by William Frederick Baudet. Narrated by Darren Roebuck. Copyright 2022 by Michael M. Conti.